مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. أخيرا وبعد سنتين على قيام المقترعين بانتخاب جو بايدن ومنح الديمقراطيين السيطرة على مجلسي الشيوخ والكونغرس، تم إجراء انتخابات جديدة. هذه المرة لم يكن اسم بايدن مدرجا على ورقة الاقتراع، إلا أنه لعب مع خصمه الرئيس السابق دونالد ترامب دورا كبيرا في الحملة الانتخابية. تركز هذه الانتخابات على السيطرة على الكونغرس وعلى السابقات الأساسية لمنصب الحاكم في الولايات مثل تكساس، فلوريدا، بنسلفانيا ونيويورك. من فاز من خسر، سنلقي نظرة عن قرب هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن على نتائج الانتخابات لنفهم الانتخاب المهم فعلا مع خبيرين سياسيين من أكثر الخبراء دراية في واشنطن، جيسيكا تايلور وديفيد هوكينز. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. Many of the pundits expected a red wave, a red tsunami, an overwhelming victory for Republicans coast to coast. But it didn't really happen. The vote was much narrower than most observers expected. What happened? Why? And how do the two parties and the leaders of these parties feel as we take a look at our election results and implications for the lame duck session for Congress and for the next 2 years of the Biden administration? I'm delighted to welcome Jessica Taylor and David Hawkins to help explain all this for our viewers in the Middle East. All right, Jessica, when you look at the elections, or even more precisely, if you're Joe Biden and you look at the elections, do you heave a sigh of relief, or are you worried about the next 2 years?
I think it's a big sigh of relief for Democrats. I mean, based on things that could have happened and that a lot of polling was telling us would happen, the fact that it looks like the House may flip, but a very narrow margin, far lower than 15 to 25 seats, which was our official range at Cook Political Report. For the Senate, of course, Republicans need only to net one. And I said that Democrats, it could be no change for Democrats up to R+3. And clearly that 2-3 is not going to happen. Republicans' best and really only scenario right now is picking up one seat. And that really means that they have to run the table in the remaining states, because it looks like Georgia's going to go to a runoff, but because they lost that Pennsylvania seat that was Republican held, that's between John Fetterman, the Democrat, and Republican Mehmet Oz, that puts them in a net negative. So now they have to win 2 seats of sort of the remaining 3. It looks like Arizona, perhaps better for Democrats in that scenario. So then it comes down to Nevada, where we're still waiting on votes. And then in Georgia, again, it feels like deja vu a little bit, because the Georgia runoffs 2 years ago decided the majority, and that could happen again.
So, David, if the Democrats, President Biden, heaving a bit of a sigh of relief, what are Republicans feeling when they look at the election results? They just took back at least one House of Congress.
Yes, I think they are looking differently at Donald Trump than they were before the election. I'd say that's the most important thing. I would say this was about the worst possible outcome for the former president as he gets ready to launch his comeback bid for 2024. Meanwhile, his arguably his most potent, if not one of his most potent rivals on the Republican side to be the Republican nominee in 2024, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, won an overwhelming victory, turned Miami red for the first time in 20 years, put together a multi-ethnic, multi-age coalition that really scored a huge landslide victory in Florida, as he essentially has helped turn Florida from a deeply purple state to a solidly red state in just a few years. So best possible night for the big rival, worst possible night for Donald Trump. A lot of Republicans, I would say now, who thought about not trying to take on Donald Trump, we'll now have a crowded Republican field for 2024. So our few minutes of rest between one election and the next is over.
Jessica, I heard Donald Trump say any election victory of a candidate that I endorsed, I should get all the credit, and any election defeat of a candidate I endorsed is totally their fault, not mine.
I think a lot of the blame does lie with Donald Trump. I've thought all cycle, the big question to me was whether candidates or climate were going to win out. The climate heavily benefited Republicans, history benefited Republicans, where President Biden's approval ratings were in some of these swing states. I mean, he was below 40 in places like Wisconsin, at or below 40 in Nevada, Arizona. Democrats should not be able to outrun President Biden by that much. There's been sort of these recriminations behind the scenes that Trump picked these weak candidates. We certainly heard it from Mitch McConnell overall. You know, it has to feel a little bit like the nightmare of 2010 and 2012 when Republicans also left winnable races on the table because of bad candidates. Now, I thought because the Senate elections have just become more parliamentary in nature, where you're voting for a party, not a person, the Republicans would still have a slight edge, but it looks like candidates matter, and they matter a lot. I think that's evident in Pennsylvania, especially with Dr. Oz moving there to run. He didn't have really deep ties there. He came out of a really brutal primary, sort of didn't use the summer to his advantage, especially as his Democratic opponent was convalescing after a stroke. And in the numbers, even as the polls were showing it close, and this was a close race, was that his favorability among voters was just underwater. They did not like him. And, you know, it kind of goes back to that old adage I think we heard a lot during the Bush years, like, who would you rather have a beer with? And I think a lot of Pennsylvanians, blue collar workers that had gone for Trump, they liked what they saw in Fetterman. He looks like Pennsylvania. He's certainly going to be an unconventional senator, but that was one of the biggest things for me. But will Republicans actually punish Trump and turn away from him because of this way? I mean, I also think we were seeing over the summer when Democratic numbers were getting better, it was when Trump was out on the campaign trail for some of these people. And the midterm elections are supposed to be a referendum on the current president. But the way that Trump inserted himself into the race and backing these candidates is almost, and I think his impending announcement did not help either. That, you know, he didn't officially announce, but he's dangled it out there enough that voters were thinking, I don't want another Trump. And if he's backing these candidates, I'm going to go the other way, even though I'm not thrilled with Biden. So is this a reckoning point? You know, Republicans didn't turn away from him after January 6th. It just feels, I mean, I've talked to so many Republican lawmakers and strategists, and they know that this is, you know, a dud and it's dragging them down, but you fear the wrath of the MAGA base and different things. So it certainly look at now Donald Trump, he's caused them to lose the House and the Senate in 2018, or House in 2018, Senate in 2020. And even if they win the House, it's by a far smaller margin, and he may have helped them hang on to the Senate majority.
And so, and David, if I assume Trump loyalists will say, well, wait a minute. If it weren't for our man, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Ohio, probably Nevada, these are all looks like victories that our guy got. Is that not a convincing argument?
It's not really a convincing argument. I think if the Republicans had nominated, more mainstream folks than in the ones that you just mentioned, they would have won even bigger, even more easily, would have had more money and resources to put into other states. I mean, yes, there's an enormous, it seems like a never-ending amount of money. You know, I'm talking to you from Philadelphia, where I've been paying attention to the Senate race. $312 million in this state alone. Enormous amounts of money. It seems bottomless, but there's a bottom somewhere. And they don't have a limitless amount of resources to spend. And if the Republicans had more obvious winners in some of those places that they did end up winning, they might have been able to spend their money elsewhere.
Jessica, can we just take a closer look at the Democrats who did well? When you look at generally, are we talking progressives? Are we talking centrists? I know it's tough to generalize, given that we had, hundreds of elections, but
yeah,
generalize for us.
Well, I mean, I think John Fetterman was more of a progressive, but he also appealed to sort of he could win back some of these Trump voters. So I think clearly, and crime was an issue that Republicans really hammered him on. They did with Mandela Barnes too in Wisconsin. Barnes is one that I do think he had a more progressive streak, and that could have hurt him in Wisconsin because he ran behind the governor, Tony Evers, who that race has been called. Wisconsin still remains very close, but it looks like Republican Ron Johnson has the path to the majority. And you look at the other Democratic senators that hung on. I mean, Mark Kelly is more in the middle there than other people. So it's, I think it's just right now where they had challengers. It's the incumbents that do seem to still fit a little bit more. They're not sort of progressive, waving people. It is more of the middle in a way, even though I wouldn't call some of these people centrist necessarily. It's sort of complicated,
right.
But
all right. When we come back after
they're Biden loyalists, I would say they're Biden loyalists. It's Biden's party. I mean, it's a
Biden's party. Okay. When we come back after the break, I'm going to ask whether we're going to have a similar phenomenon as we did in 2020. Are we going to have people protesting the results, election denying 2022 in just a moment? Again, our guests today include Jessica Taylor. Jessica is the Senate and Governors editor for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, and she is senior author of the 2022 edition of the Almanac of American Politics. Previously, she was a political reporter for National Public Radio and NBC News. Also joining us is David Hawkins. David is senior editor of The American Leader, a nonprofit taking on America's biggest systemic problems. He was also the founding editor of thefulcrum.com, and he spent 2 decades as senior editor at CQ and Roll Call, 2 must-read news sites covering Capitol Hill. All right, 2 years ago, we had the phenomenon of losers not accepting defeat. And this eventually morphed into the January 6th insurrection in the Capitol. I know it's early days after our midterm elections, but do we see this phenomenon again, or are losers in our vote more graciously accepting the results of the voters' decisions? Jessica?
I've been a little more encouraged over election night that we do see some of these Trump-backed Republicans acknowledging the results and conceding, particularly in Michigan, where Scooter Dixon, the Republican nominee Trump had backed against Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer, she conceded after the race was called. Also, Tim Michels, another Trump acolyte in Wisconsin, running against the Democratic governor there, Tony Evers, he did as well.
Jessica, I want to ask you about one name we're going to hear a lot more of. And that is the likely new Speaker of the House. Even with a narrow majority, we're going to likely see a shift away from Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who's been running the lower house of Congress for the Democrats, to a man named Kevin McCarthy, who is at least expected to be elected by his Republican colleagues to be the Speaker of the House for a Republican majority. Who is he, and how does he run the narrowest of majorities in a new Congress?
I mean, Kevin McCarthy has eyed the speakership for years. Ever since he's been in Congress, he's worked up the ranks. He sat behind as other speakers have failed, Boehner and Ryan, and he has a more raucous caucus right now than even they had. I think when you have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert actually in Colorado, looks like she might lose. That was a surprise race that was solid Republican, but you do have some of these certainly election deniers and rabble rousers, as I call them, coming in. And if that's a slim majority, he was already sort of on thinner ice trying to convince things to go. He's good at raising money. That has certainly helped him. And, they did get behind some good candidates that ended up flipping races that were particularly targeted for those districts. There was a female veteran in Virginia 2, which was a highly targeted race against Elaine Luria, one of these sort of national security Democrats. She sat on the January 6th committee, and that was where they felt like they got the right candidate and they were able to flip those seats. But a lot of other places, you had more even MAGA House candidates that come through and they fell short. So, he was predicting not that long ago that he felt like Republicans could pick up 60 seats. I mean, 6 at this point feels like it would be a victory, just a very narrow one. So I am really interested if other Republicans try to challenge him. I would look particularly at the whip Steve Scalise, whether that happens. Elise Stefanik in New York is another person who has been moving up the leadership ranks. So we could have some sort of palace intrigue in what happens in that regard. I mean, this is, even if he has a majority, this is not going to be an easy caucus for McCarthy to control.
Raucous caucus. I'm sure you've been waiting just to say that on air.
Just came to me, actually, so I like it.
David, let me ask you another big picture question. So there were a handful of big themes people rolled out. Democrats rolled out for this campaign. The fate of our democracy is at risk, and the right to choose, the abortion issue. Republicans rolled out the economy's stupid and crime. These were the two big competing narratives. In the end, was it the narratives that mattered? Was it the candidates? Was it Trump versus Biden? What can we say about all this?
Well, it was obviously the economy. It was less the economy than we all thought it was, even on election day. I mean, I think other issues, many of them that you just ticked off, must have had some influence. I mean, I think one very conservative friend of mine he's not a Trumper, but he's in this business. I won't say his name. Really angry. He said, for all this economic anxiety, and they still wouldn't vote for our crazies. Even this amount of anxiety wouldn't get them to vote for the super conservative MAGA folks. So I think it was, as we talked about earlier, candidate quality. It was more, in some close places, it was more about abortion than I think the conventional wisdom was. Supreme Court struck down the constitutional right to an abortion this summer. That became the galvanizing issue for much of the summer. Then the economy seemed to overtake it. It seemed like abortion had sort of peaked as an issue too soon. The exit polls showed that it came back. I mean, that people were thinking about it, women especially. Women voted overwhelmingly, solidly for the Democrats. It has preserved. Now, democracy as an issue, that's an issue dear to my heart, sort of professionally. I'm sure to Jessica's as well. This notion that democracy was on the ballot, I guess it had some effect in some places. As I say, that many of the election deniers who were challenging members of Congress lost. So it seems to be a hodgepodge of things. All these many days later, I'm still shocked that the election result was what it was. I've rarely been more emphatically wrong. I hope to go back and delete all my email predictions from election night.
It was just a very strange election. Like, there were just not one coherent pattern in places, that you could have the chair of the DCCC, Sean Patrick Maloney.
That's lose. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee.
He could lose even as Democrats are having a better night. Like, just there's no real big pattern. It is very much one of the strangest elections and election results that I've seen in my career.
Strange election results. All right, we're going to close on that. Thank you so much, Jessica Taylor, David Hawkins, for helping to try to explain the strange night of American democracy to our viewers in the Middle East. Thank you for joining me on Dakhel, Washington. To say that America is different from most other democracies is an understatement. We have a complicated, decentralized system of elections in which we really hold around 10,000 different elections every 2 years under rules set by almost as many different jurisdictions and governing bodies. We have an equally complicated, decentralized system of federal government in which powers and authorities are divided among states, counties, cities, towns, and of course, the central government in Washington, with many different layers of state and federal courts adjudicating disputes among and between all of these. Somehow it has worked for more than 200 years, since the Constitution replaced an even more complicated, decentralized, and failed system. It worked except for the Civil War, of course. Some, including my own children, warn that we are on the verge of a new civil war, given how divided our country is, and I take them seriously. But my bet is on the resilience and versatility of our system. I hope it's a smart bet. One of the many oddities of our system is the time built into our political calendar for the nation and its institutions to digest change. In most parliamentary democracies, if the election results spell defeat for the incumbent party in the morning, the new government takes office that afternoon with something close to instantaneous change. Not so in America. For the first 150 years of our republic, presidents were elected in the first week of November, but didn't take office until the first week of March the following year. In the 1930s, that was moved up to the third week of January, but that still gives the outgoing president 10 weeks in the White House. Similarly, with Congress, new senators and representatives are chosen in the first week of November, but they don't take up their office until the first week of January. During that 2-month period, they're called lame ducks, meaning they can waddle, but they can't fly. Waddling, however, should not be taken for granted. I think the framers of our Constitution knew a bit about human nature when they inserted this waiting period before the election victors could take over the reins of power. There are at least 2 benefits to this. First, the outgoing legislators are freed from the crushing weight of politics to make a few decisions and cast a few votes that might be necessary but unpopular, knowing that the voters have already decided their fate. This could be on an issue like raising the debt limit, which no one likes to do, or sending more weapons and financial support to Ukraine, which somehow became a difficult thing for many Republicans to support, at least out on the stump. And secondly, the incoming legislators might usefully take a few weeks to go into political detox, draining themselves of the venom of hard-fought campaigns to transform themselves from candidates to legislators, from ideologues to problem solvers, committed to the public good, not the next poll. Perhaps I'm a hopeless romantic about all this, but I hope our senators and congresspeople, those about to leave Washington, those about to arrive, and those who are here to stay, take advantage of lame duck time here in Washington to do the people's business. It really is a gift that is more than 2 centuries in the making. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن نتيجة انتخابات أمريكا التشريعية، تواصلوا معي رجاءً عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو تراسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم.